Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and the role of women in the Jewish tradition, or perhaps better said, the perceived status of women in the Orthodox Jewish community, is that of a sort of second-class person in relationship to men. And I use the word perceived because in many, many ways that's both a misunderstanding and a distortion of the Jewish tradition and of Jewish life. Many, many women in the Orthodox Jewish community do not feel they are of any less value than men. They do not feel second class. And while Jewish law, halacha, and Jewish custom, Jewish practice, minhag, does make distinctions between men and women, the differences do not reflect a denigration of women. And in many profound ways, the Jewish tradition has been light years ahead of contemporary society in terms of respecting the needs of women, the responsibilities women bear for the future well-being of the Jewish family and of the Jewish community. And there's an honoring of the personhood of women. If you've ever been lucky enough to be at a traditional Jewish home for Friday night Shabbat, one of the most beautiful, and again, one of the most profound moments is when the husband recites with love and appreciation the Eshes Chayil, extolling the virtues of a devoted wife and mother and woman. At the same time, the sociology of the traditional Jewish community has, in some instances, closed certain opportunities to women in areas of Jewish learning and Jewish leadership. And one of the enlightening contributions of what tends to be called modern Orthodoxy or open Orthodoxy is the way this movement seeks to include women in Jewish learning and in Jewish leadership. And so truly wonderful and talented men and women have been in the forefront of this trend in modern Orthodox life. People like Avi Weiss and Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz, who've created institutions, yeshivot, for women here in the United States. And one of the most successful and significant institutions in Israel to be inclusive of women was created by Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, who in addition to being the founding chief rabbi of the city of Efrat, and of course here at Lincoln Center in New York, also founded in 1983 a new educational institution both in Israel and the United States known as Ohr Torah Stone. I hope many of you know Shlomo Riskin. You may have seen him here on JBS many times. He's been kind enough to sit with me over and over again on L'Chaim. I have enormous regard for him and affection for him. And of course, he can be seen every Friday morning and afternoon here on JBS, doing a drash on the parasha of the week, leading into JBS's live telecast of Friday night Shabbat services. But now Shlomo Riskin is handing the leadership role of Ohr Torah Stone onto a new presence who will guide its future. And on this edition of L'Chaim, it's a pleasure for me to be sitting with the man who succeeds Shlomo Riskin at Ohr Torah Stone, Kenneth Brander, a most creative, charismatic, modern Orthodox rabbi, currently serves Yeshiva University as Vice President for University and Community Life. Kenny Brander also teaches in YU's Rabbinical School and heads YU's graduate program of Advanced Talmudic Studies and Biblical Interpretation for Women. to tell you a little bit more about his rabbinic career. Before coming to YU in 2013, Kenny Brander had a wonderful 14-year tenure as a congregational rabbi of the Boca Raton Synagogue. While in South Florida, Kenny founded the Katz Yeshiva High School, as well as Palm Beach County's first mikveh, and helped to formalize kashrut for the community and created a kollel to further Jewish education. And under his leadership, the synagogue in Boca grew from 60 families to 600 families. And now, Kenny assumes the leadership of Ohr Torah Stone as president and rosh yeshiva. It is such an honor and kick for me to have you at this table. Thank you for joining us. I'm very privileged to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, before we talk about Ohr Torah Stone, a little bit about you. So I mentioned your rabbinic career in Boca, but I don't know where you were born and what kind of home you were raised in. Tell us a little bit about your early life.
Well, I was born in Mount Clemens, Michigan.
Aha.
My father was a rabbi of a synagogue at that point.
Orthodox?
Orthodox synagogue in Mount Clemens, Michigan. Actually took over a synagogue at the request of Yeshiva University after the synagogue had gone through a turbulent time and came to Mount Clemens. And then we moved.
What was his name?
Aaron. His name is Aaron Brander.
Aaron Brander, good for him.
And my father, Aaron Brander, and my mother, Ellen Brander, they should live and be well. We moved to Oak Park, Michigan, where he worked with Rabbi Chaim Donin of blessed memory and helped to start and develop a wonderful Hebrew school. And at that time, it was the largest Hebrew school in the whole Detroit area, serving hundreds of young people. And I still remember the various Shabbatons, the spiritual weekends that we participated in, and when Rav Avi would come for Shabbat, and we would engage with him. In fact, I remember when Rabbi Weiss asked my father to go to the Soviet Union with him, and I think my mother said no, but his son, myself, I went.
Did you?
As his messenger. And
you're shaliach. You were a shaliach for your father. Roughly what year?
Right while it was still, I went in,
it was early.
In the 80s.
Yes.
In the 80s, with a group of Yeshiva University students and actually a group of young people who were in high school, and we taught underground kindergartens until we got thrown out.
This is more, you were part of Avi Weiss's young army.
I had the privilege of sharing a jail cell with Avi Weiss, and we shared words of Torah in that jail cell before our charges got dismissed.
Yes. By the way, then we do share one small thing in common. The only time I've ever been arrested is when I was protesting with Avi in front of the Soviet embassy here in Manhattan. But I didn't end up in jail studying Torah with him. That's very, very special. He is, by the way, a most unusual both rabbi and human being, yes?
Yes, he is. He has a great portion in the world to come.
Absolutely. Okay, so did you have siblings?
Yes, I'm blessed to have 4 siblings.
Where were you in the 5?
I'm the oldest of the 5.
Okay.
And we eventually then moved to New York when I was actually in 5th grade. And we lived in Queens, New York. A pretty, traditional Orthodox lifestyle. And
what was your father doing then?
My father was principal of a large school called Yeshiva of Central Queens, and did so for the rest of his professional life until he decided to retire, and then volunteered. My mother is actually a public school reading specialist, and also continues to volunteer and to help people read.
In terms of tone, texture, what were they like?
Well, both my parents, my father survived the Holocaust. He was hidden in the Holocaust and came here when he was 13 years old.
Where's he from?
From Poland. He didn't talk about it much, and I'm sure that he's not even happy that I'm mentioning it on the air here, but he'll have to live with that. My mother was born here, but her parents came from Germany. My parents have always been engaging people. They've always been involved with acts of loving kindness, They've always been hard workers, and they modeled for my siblings and for myself hard work. They always built the house together as true partners, celebrating the first part of what you said so beautifully, the Eshet Chayil, where they both, worked together to build the home. My father had long hours. My mother choreographed her professional life around what she considered to be her more important role, and that is bringing up her children and spending time with grandchildren, and thank God, blessed with great-grandchildren.
How many? How many grandchildren and great-grandchildren?
I thank
That
God
many?
I've lost
That
count.
many?
Thank God I've lost
Mazel.
count.
How about for you? How many children do you have?
We are blessed with 5 children
Mazel.
and with 2 daughters-in-law, and we consider them no different than our children.
Absolutely.
So we're blessed with 7 children currently, and we're also blessed most recently with 2 grandchildren.
Mazel tov again.
One is Sabra and one an American. So
Really?
right.
When you were young, whatever orthodoxy was in your home with your father, who was a rabbi in many ways, and ultimately was really involved in Jewish education, do you remember loving it, or were there any strains because of the orthodoxy of your household?
I don't think there was. The answer is there were strains, but I don't think the strains were for the orthodoxy in my household as much as it was for the fact that I didn't feel inspired in the schools that I went to. And when I had the privilege with lay leaders to build a high school in Boca Raton, my wife would say it was the psychological response to what I had went through when I was a teenager.
You were not going to do to children what was done to you.
Correct. I wanted it to be an inspired experience where we didn't just learn Talmud, but we understood the purpose of it. The ox, being gored or goring in the public thoroughfare is about the responsibility and respect of public and private property, and the responsibility that we have to illuminate a certain vision when we engage in society. That small narrative was never communicated.
Yes.
And that makes all the difference in the world. And the whole idea of Jewish philosophy and being able to engage in Jewish philosophy, and the responsibility and the respect to question, which is so important. And Judaism is about questions.
Absolutely. Were you denied that opportunity as a child? And it was in the context, whatever educational context you had, that was not, it was not respected the way you try to respect it in the institutions you created.
Right. I wouldn't say it was denied, but it wasn't encouraged. And I think it has to be encouraged when you're talking to teenagers. Mm-hmm. And while I, have great friends from my educational upbringing, and they still remain friends, I don't think it was an inspiring experience. I don't want to speak for anybody else. I'll just speak for myself. I didn't find it to be an inspiring experience.
Then at what point in your life and what triggers your own excitement with and love for this Jewish tradition that you become a major force on the American Jewish scene for transmitting that? So at some point you did fall in love. How and why?
So I think my parents always kept me connected. There were times in which I thought about abandoning, but I think my parents' commitment kept me connected. And sometimes their frustration with my questioning kept me connected. But then I spent 2 years in Israel studying at a yeshivat Hesder, which is a school in which the Israelis in the school are both involved in study, and they serve in the Israeli Defense Force. And it was the first time that I had met serious Talmud scholars and serious young people who were studying from literally 8 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock at night, but took the time to run and to exercise because they served in the Tank Corps or in the paratroopers. It was a transformational experience. I remember my Talmud teacher came to America for the first time to interview prospective students. And he told me it was the first time he was in a plane that he didn't jump out of. So, all of a sudden you have a Talmud teacher who's a paratrooper, who's doing a 2-mile run every single day.
Very different model.
It's a very different model.
Yeah.
And that was inspiring. We all had a older study partner as we came there at 18 or 19. Unfortunately, my study partner a year after I left was the Lebanon War, and unfortunately, he was killed in the Lebanon War, and actually has a child named. His wife was pregnant at the time, named in his honor, Shlomo Uman, and that also left an indelible impression. So I think that the Israel experience for me was transformational. Not the loss of a study partner, but really the life and their commitment and their selfless engagement with beautiful ideals. And the second thing was really, I had a privilege that I never deserved, and that was the time that I had at Yeshiva University. First of all, Yeshiva University itself is an inspiring place. The Soviet Jewry movement, really, its cradle was, as Glenn Richter will tell you, really the patriarch of the Soviet Jewry movement was Yeshiva University, and I was part of that. But also the fact to be able to live as a student assistant to Rabbi Soloveitchik.
Were you?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So
how lucky.
yes, so I spent
Luck
a few
has
years.
followed you. You've had some good mazel.
Right. I've just been blessed my whole life.
What was that like?
It was
You
just
working with Rav Soloveitchik.
Well, I wouldn't call it working with Rabbi Soloveitchik. I would call the family had always asked students to basically serve as his assistants.
What did you do for him?
Well, I was there towards the end of his tenure at Yeshiva University. Actually, our wedding, which he performed, was the last public event that he was at. So it was a very interesting wedding because, we had 300 people, but no one sat in their seats.
Yes.
It was like, they
All
just,
around,
they,
yes.
they had no interest in seeing me. They had interest in seeing the bride and Rabbi Soloveitchik.
Yes.
And the conversations that
That's
went
not an
underneath.
insult to you.
I don't take it as
If
an
I were
insult.
there, that's all I'd care. I would
Right,
be in
right.
awe. Everybody was in awe.
Right.
Yeah. But wait, I hope the audience understands. Rav Soloveitchik, without question, is the single greatest presence within the modern Orthodox world, a gadol of our generation who was able to really shape an understanding of halacha, an understanding of Jewish life, and motivated people like Kenneth Brander here to want to be more engaged in an intelligent Judaism. Is it fair for me to say, I never met the man. I never studied with the man. I have read him vociferously. He has had a profound impact on my own thinking and my own way of relating to Torah. And I am not an Orthodox Jew, but there are such profound concepts and insights and an openness that is fabulous. The influence he had, not simply at Yeshiva University, and he comes out of Boston and was influencing Maimonides, but you're a product of an incredible mind, and so's Riskin, and so's Weiss, and so's Greenberg, and Berman. They come out of this extraordinary understanding of Judaism, and lo and behold, you are, when I said working with, you're working for, but you're in very close contact with him, so much so. He must have had a great affection for you, for him to be willing to be the Masada Kedushin at your chuppah, yes?
Well, again, it was a blessing. I want to make it clear because I want to be intellectually honest. I was 22, 23 years old when this was going on, so I didn't have the intellectual capacity to fully appreciate his greatness.
Very honest. Very
but
honest.
At the same time, to watch, not only to have the privilege of being in his shiur, being in his class, and to watch the way he would teach Talmud, and the way in which he marshaled multiple generations of medieval commentaries or modern commentaries to debate the Talmud, so much so you actually felt that those personalities were actually like sitting on the table. It was so live. But also outside the classroom, when it wasn't about being so exact. In the classroom, he was an exact master teacher and demanded of his students a certain integrity to the text and to and not to have a whimsical approach to the text, but rather to understand the text. But outside the classroom, to watch the way he engaged with everybody, from the person who washed the floors to titans in industry, to Christian thinkers, to Jewish leaders. And also, it's also appropriate to mention that Rabbi Soloveitchik had multiple types of students. I mean, you look at people like Rabbi Mordechai Willig and Rabbi Herschel Schachter, they are equally his students. Rabbi Lichtenstein, and of blessed memory. They are significant personalities who I think have done major work in actually protecting the Jewish women. And they are also products of his unbelievable scholarship. And it's just, he continues to be a force. But to be able to live with him, literally live with him in the apartment that he had at Yeshiva University, and to be able to watch the way he engaged with people and to have informal conversations with him, and to watch the informal conversations he had with my bride-to-be at that point in time, or the fact that he came to our engagement party and the way he just treated us. It was just...
Mazal tov. By the way, I don't mean to embarrass you. You must have been something of a star if you were chosen to be in that situation.
Well, I mean, I'll leave that up to the others who were part of it. But clearly, some of my friends who were also served as we called them shamashim, as Rabbi Soloveitchik's student assistants. They were stars. But this is again, what happened in that apartment was very unique. We watched meetings of the highest level. We were on conversations with a prime minister, or with the Rabbi of Lubavitch, or with rabbis, as well as, again, thought leaders from different faith systems, from the Christian community. But we always had an understanding. The fact that we had Menachem Begin, personal phone number in our pockets was not something that we, not that there was the ability to just put it on Facebook, but it wouldn't, it was not something that we did. But to see the way Rabbi Soloveitchik engaged, again, with so many people, and the way he did it with such reverence and respect, and how he was pained by the challenges that others had, so much so that it affected him physically, it was as important as reading Kierkegaard with him.
I understand. When you talked about Soloveitchik's philosophy of teaching Talmud, there is I want to be careful, because I don't mean to disparage anyone. There are different styles, and styles work in different contexts for different people. But there is a sort of a view we have of the classic Talmudic setting, in which it is less questioning and more an attempt to make sure you end up understanding. You can quote the whole passage, you understand the law, and it's all about the bottom line. It's about the law. It is not necessarily about the philosophy inside the Talmudic discussion that produces a law. And the law, by the way, people should understand, is also an evolutionary process. It's not like the Talmud. It's not the Shulchan Aruch. The Talmud is not a code of Jewish law, but the law comes out of the Talmud. So I'm asking you whether what people often imagine the Talmudic process to be, is it fair for me to say that it was not the same for Soloveitchik, that it was not simply, I want you to learn this by rote and know what the bottom line was, is it had more to do with understanding a thought process that is revealed in the Talmud. That's not to say it wasn't important for you to know the text, understand the text, and know what the law, how the law was emerging out of that text, but that it was more than what the law was. There was a thought process, a value system is expressed through Talmudic literature and the dialectic that you discuss, the give and take. I love the picture, and I've heard this from others before, where he literally had the different Rabbanim all present, arguing for their positions. But I want to know the extent to which I'm romanticizing this, or you think I'm describing something accurately.
I don't think you're romanticizing it. I think it's what's called in the Brisker methodology. Rabbi Soloveitchik was interested in the journey as much as he was in the destination. And we spent a lot more time on the journey. Now, that doesn't mean that there were times in which he said, we're going to spend some time just doing halacha. And I remember one semester where we learned the laws of Shabbat. And our text was the Shulchan Aruch and Maimonides' Mishnah Torah.
Yes.
But evolving from that was understanding the journey. But we started almost from the destination. But from the more of the time, it was all about the journey and about trying to understand the journey and having a certain respect for the journey and to understand how everyone grappled with the journey. I share with you like one unbelievable story that really, I remember once, and again, when you were the student assistant, you have a certain relationship. So I remember, I'll share just one story, and that is that after like a 2.5-hour class, which Rabbi Soloveitchik always gave, even though the doctors had limited it to 2 hours, but he never listened to the doctors. And once and twice I tried to convince him to listen to the doctors, but it was not a purposeful conversation. And after he finished giving the class, and there was a conversation in the class, a young student asked him a question at the end of the class, about 2.5-hour presentation. And as Rabbi Soloveitchik, we were walking back from First Hall, where the lecture was given at Yeshiva University, to his apartment in the Morgenstern dormitory, which is like across Amsterdam Avenue. He asks me if I know where that student eats lunch. I said, yes. He said, let's go there. We walked there. It was like a hamburger place. We walk into this place. There's pinball games. And Rabbi Soloveitchik walks in there. A bunch of college students see Rabbi Soloveitchik walking in there. Everybody playing pinball like freezes. Everybody loses their turn. The student was eating his hamburger, and the hamburgers there were, let's just say, they were a little tough to digest. And Rabbi Soloveitchik turns to this young student and says, I thought about your question. You're right, and I was wrong. And tomorrow we're going to redo the entire sugya, the entire section, over based on the question that you raised.
That's a very impressive story.
Yeah. There was a certain integrity to the way he communicated to us.
By the way, what also impresses me is he could say, I was wrong.
Right.
There are some professors, and not only within the Jewish world,
Right.
those words never come out of their mouth.
Right.
And this is, again, one of the great lights of Jewish learning, and he could say to a student, I was wrong and you were right.
Right.
And we're going to go back and do it again. That is a fabulous story. I want to tell you something that Chaim Potok said to me. Chaim Potok was raised in an Orthodox home. For various reasons, he wanted to be first an artist. And his parents would have none of that. You didn't draw, you didn't make images, you couldn't be an artist. So he began to write. And he wanted to be a novelist. And for reasons which are not quite clear to me, he thought that if he went to JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which at that time, by the way, was also a bastion of Jewish learning. It may have been the single most important non-Orthodox institution, certainly of its era. We're talking here 50s, through 40s, 50s, with Finkelstein and with Heschel and with Kaplan and with Gordis, fabulous lights. As he's leaving, he says to me, his father says one line to him. He's leaving to go to JTS. His father says, don't become a goy. He was going to study at the Conservative Movement's rabbinical school, which was very Talmudically oriented. And within the conservative movement, regardless of how conservative Jews acted in their congregations, the conservative rabbinate had a sense that they certainly wanted to live an Orthodox life. And then Potok told me this story, and I want to hear you comment on it. he talked about how the Midrash conveys the mindset of the Jew, the ambivalence of life, which the Jewish tradition has enormous regard for, that people may doubt, people may question, and that the answer isn't always simple intellectually. There might be a law, but there was room in the Jewish tradition to understand the ambiguity of life and the complexities of life. And he felt Midrash was the area in which that understanding was conveyed. And I said to him, very often I meet Orthodox rabbis, wonderful people. They don't have an appreciation for Midrash. And his answer to me was, when we studied Talmud, and he's not talking about JTS, as a young person in yeshiva in, I don't remember whether it was Brooklyn or where it was, they would study a daf and a daf and a daf, page after page. If they got to a Midrash, they would skip it. And as a result, he did not grow up in an environment where Midrash was part of his Orthodox life. It comes later, and he comes to appreciate it in a wonderfully profound way. My experience with Soloveitchik, secondhand, and also through all of the rabbis who I am close to, who studied with him, who were his disciples, there's an extraordinary appreciation for how Midrash conveys Jewish values and how it also shapes one's relationship to halakha. I want to know your reaction to what I've described. To what extent do you think Potok is right or describing something accurately, that my reaction to it is accurate, and I want to know where you stand on the issue of the importance of Midrash within the Talmudic world, the Talmudic scene, and Jewish learning overall.
Wow. Well, let's start with, first of all, there's a reason why the Talmud, which is really the bastion and so important why both men and women engage in the study of Talmud, both has what we would call deals with Jewish law as well as with Jewish philosophy issues, because you can't bifurcate them and you can't silo them. And when we do that, we lose nuance. And therefore it is important, and the rabbis did this on purpose, where they included both Talmud law and Talmud, what we would call Agadah, which Maimonides says in his introduction to the 11th chapter of Sanhedrin, the chapter called Chelek, where Maimonides has a full introduction where he writes about how critically important it is to study the Midrash of the Talmud and to understand that the deep secrets and nuances of Jewish tradition are part and parcel of the Agadah, and that on purpose, those secrets were not just revealed, but required struggle. And I think that Rabbi Soloveitchik, in a host of his works that you've read, really tries to use Midrash as a point of departure for it. And if you ever read or listen to the lectures of his son-in-law, Rabbi Lichtenstein of blessed memory, here's an individual who was able to take his PhD from Harvard in English literature and use English literature as a means through which to parse Midrash. In fact, when we had the privilege of starting the high school that you mentioned in Boca Raton, the director of the English department we sent to Israel to review the English curriculum with someone who had a PhD from Harvard University in English literature, his name being Rabbi Dr. Aaron Lichtenstein. What better person to review your English literature curriculum than someone who is a great Talmudist, someone who is a great person who cares for every human being, as well as somebody who understands the material. So I think that Rabbi Soloveitchik, it depended on what type of class he was given. When he gave a Chumash, a Bible class, or when he taught in the Revel Graduate School that dealt with Jewish history and philosophy, and he was a lecturer and a professor there for many years, before my stint at Yeshiva University, but during the stint of many of the people that you mentioned who were true students of his, he specifically focused on that. I think when he gave a Talmud class, the texts that we used were not Agadic, although before the holidays, when he wanted to give us a message, then he would use Agadic texts to give us a message. And incidentally, before the holidays, Yeshiva University's class with Rabbi Soloveitchik swelled with visitors from other yeshivot because they were already off for their intercession, and Yeshiva University followed an academic calendar. So we weren't off 2 weeks before Passover started. So they would come and listen to him. I had the privilege of meeting Chaim Potak, of blessed memory, once. He came to visit in Boca Raton, Florida. Nachum Sarna, of blessed memory, who was, again, one of the blessings of my life. Nachum and Helen Sarna were members of the Boca Raton Synagogue congregation, an Orthodox synagogue. And he would come to my Bible class, which is like absurd. It caused me to prepare heavily.
Absolutely.
And my wife and I had what we called a date night, where we would go to Nachum Sarna's house and he would study with us.
Wow.
Bible.
Wow.
And he was actually the person who motivated me to get a PhD. He's the one who sat with me to the point where his son, Dr. Jonathan Sarna,
one of the great historians on the American Jewish scene.
Yeah, and a quintessential mensch. He agreed to actually help supervise my dissertation, almost because he felt his father got me into it. He was going to make sure that he saw me through it. But I think that when we try to make sure that we celebrate the latitude and longitude of Jewish teachings, it's important that there be a sacred synergy between both what we would call the halachic Talmud and the Agadic Talmud.
Absolutely.
And that's critically important.
Both are necessary.
Both are necessary. And I found that all of my teachers at Yeshiva University
respected
that and would engage in that at different times, because they're different disciplines.
Yes.
But the other piece is that I find at Ohr Torah Stone, and what Rabbi Riskin has accomplished is he has made sure that that's part of the conversation, even in the yeshivot, the schools of higher learning for both men and women that are focused on what we would call the halachic part of Talmud. But there's also a very serious focus on the philosophical, agadic components of Talmud, because I think you need both to become a whole person. And there is a dialectic that you can see there, and really there is a holiness to the dialectic. That's a Rabbi Soloveitchik concept borrowed from Kierkegaard. And I think that's critically important.
I love the way you say it. And it isn't meant to be critical. I'm saying that there are other portions of the Jewish community where the appreciation for Agadah and for Midrash is not the same. And this leads me to, I want you to talk about what modern or open Orthodoxy mean to you, and as opposed to what is called mainstream Orthodoxy or even traditional Orthodoxy. But you're part of a movement because you're part of what Avi Weiss has created and now what Shlomo Riskin has created. And you come under criticism. And when I say you, I don't know you personally, but your movement, your approach to Orthodox Jewish life, better said, your approach to what it means to live a traditional Jewish life, comes under criticism from those who say, you're cheating. You are extending the boundaries beyond authentic halakha. What you're willing to do with women, for example, is there's no rabbah in mainstream Orthodox life. There's no woman acting in similar capacities as a rabbi. And there are all kinds of halakhic questions about what a woman may and may not do under the halakha in terms of being what's called a shaliach tzibur, a representative of the community, a chazan, someone who leads prayer. And so there are those who stand over against the Avi Weisses and the Shlomo Riskins and the Yitz Greenbergs and the Kenny Branders and say, you know what, your orthodoxy isn't real. It's not authentic. It's not rigorous enough. You are, you got 1 foot outside of orthodoxy. And in part for me, it has to do with, again, the appreciation for what I believe is absolutely the Talmudic tradition, which does include Agadah, which does allow for not only questions, but allow for doubt. And I believe it is you never criticize a Jew who's living a Jewish life and at the same time lives in doubt. But I want you to talk to this issue. To what extent, when you hear people you respect say to you in a nice way, you know, what you're doing is nice, but it's not really authentic halachic Judaism, and therefore your orthodoxy is in some way tainted. Speak to that for me.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize the fact that I doubt many things.
You do.
I doubt many things in life. Here's some of the things I don't doubt. I don't doubt the importance of making sure that every Jew feels that they can study without any impediments, and therefore the importance for both men and women to be able to study at the highest level. It can't be that a woman can get a PhD in any topic that she wants, but can't study Judaism at the highest level.
And I'm going to let you go on, but just to clarify, is there anything in halakha, Talmudic literature, the codes, which prohibits a woman from learning?
There are sentences here and there that can be used. I think that they are currently misused.
Give me a halakha.
There's a statement that says whoever teaches their daughter Talmud as if they're teaching them foolishness. But it's important to recognize the fact that if you look at all the commentaries on that statement, the commentaries say that that was based at a time where women had limited education, so they couldn't understand the Talmudic literature simply because they were not schooled.
Yes, excuse me though. I did not hear a law there. There might be a maxim, there might be a
Okay.
but there's no halakha that says you have violated a Torah law by teaching a woman anything. If I'm wrong, tell me.
No, it is. Some people do codify that in codes of Jewish law. But again, I think the codification, there are times in which, in this case, where there are reasons given for the law, if those reasons don't apply and just the opposite, the reasons are totally reversed because of society, then as Rabbi Lichtenstein said, whoever doesn't teach their daughter Talmud is if they're teaching them foolishness, because of the responsibility to make sure that the women who have served as really the cornerstone of the Jewish home have to understand the Masorah, have to understand the Jewish tradition. How can it be that we don't afford the opportunity for women to study at the highest level?
Of course. But you've given a perfect example of what I'm trying to say. There's an Orthodox, part of the Orthodox community would look at what you've just done to what you tell me is a halakha, and they will say you're distorting it because you want to change it.
Though I would invite those people to email me at their earliest convenience, and I'll share with them the sources, and we can have a intelligent conversation about it.
Very good.
That's number one. The second thing is, and again, in the spirit of being totally transparent, and that is, I don't fully believe that the movement of moving certain issues forward are uniformed. In other words, I don't fully subscribe to everything that Rabbi Weiss has done on issues of women, and neither does Rabbi Riskin. Rabbi Riskin has clearly written texts that don't fully endorse and actually sometimes speak out against what others have done.
Give
on
me an
these issues,
example.
like for partnership services. Rabbi Riskin has written very strongly in Hebrew, and I'm sure eventually will be translated into English, but Hebrew is still the text of scholarship in Judaism, against partnership services.
What's a partnership service?
A partnership service is similar to what you had just articulated, and that is a service which is co-led by both men and women. That is not consistent with an Orthodox tradition. It doesn't mean, I want to make it clear, I have many friends that I have respect for who I consider to be serious Jews, who are part of the Reform and Conservative movement, and I consider them not only dear friends, but they've served as mentors, and I clearly believe with every fiber of my body that they are as serious about their Judaism as I am.
How did we get from a partnership service of Avi Weiss to Reform and Conservative Judaism? You understand the fact that that would occur to you and that you would even say it in the same paragraph reflects what the criticism is of the
I think that's a good question, but I think we have to be, when you are pioneering new ground, and I think fortunately or unfortunately, but the reality is that when you are pioneering new ground, you have to be very careful about which stands that you take, because the women's issue could be perceived as the third rail for any person interested in advancing a leadership role in the Jewish community. I personally feel that it is the most critical issue that we need, one of the most critical issues that we need to deal with, along with conversion, along with making sure that all Jews find a place to be able to engage in a relationship with God, and that Israel is a place for all Jews, but the responsibility of making sure that we promote within the Orthodox community, because that was the question, within the Orthodox community, we have to make sure that we're not just looking at Agadah, but we're also looking at what we would call the dry halacha. So for me, the halacha clearly speaks to, and there is historical precedent for women of knowledge to play leadership roles in the Jewish community. And we need to celebrate that, because they represent 51% of, I'm speaking just for the Orthodox community, of the Orthodox community, and we should not and we are the poorer for the fact that they cannot play leadership roles in the Jewish community. We're poorer for that. Not just the fact that my granddaughter is poorer for that, because I want my granddaughter to have a Talmud teacher who is a woman. But I also want my grandson to be able to have a Talmud teacher who is a woman. It's not just the women that are the poor for that. It's the Jewish community that's the poor for that. I want to champion that. I also want to champion the responsibilities, and I believe that it's not me. I believe that this is what Jewish law speaks to. I want to champion that women can play leadership roles. I want to do it within the prism of Orthodox Jewish law. And I'm willing to have the conversation with anybody who wants to talk about Orthodox Jewish law and to see that we're not, going over the edge. But I believe that sometimes living on the edge is not such a bad thing. And it means that we live in color, not in black and white. And sometimes if there's a price to pay for being in color, I'm willing to pay that price. But I think it's also important to recognize the fact that we are moving both in Israel and in America. We are moving at a rapid velocity of women playing leadership roles. And by the way, although this was not part of the question, I think it needs to be stated, I think that sometimes the diaspora Jewry moves slower on women's advancement in scholarship and in other areas because of their concerns of the Reform and Conservative community. By the way, that might not be a fair thing. It might not be a correct thing, but it's almost like a speed bump. It's like you feel the need to look over your left shoulder. I think in Israel, there is so much more focus on women being able to find that scholarship. Ohr Torah Stone has a program where women study for 5 years Jewish law, post-high school, post-serving in the army. There's no program that celebrates that depth outside of Israel. the idea that you can study for 2 years in great depth and then serve in the IDF, women, that doesn't exist. It's a different dynamic, it's a different fabric. It's a much more, it's a much more holistic fabric. What I would like to see happen is opportunities for women to play leadership roles that are scribed within halakha in synagogues as educators, for them to play the roles as teachers in schools.
That's what you mean by leadership. Are you limiting leadership to teaching situations?
No.
So give us a sense of what you mean, the broad range of leadership positions you believe would be totally consistent with halakha.
Women should be, why aren't women chaplains serving as clergy, as chaplains in hospitals? Why aren't women playing leadership roles in synagogues? No different than the rabbis are playing. In other words, the major core job of a rabbi in a synagogue is, in an Orthodox synagogue, the rabbi doesn't lead the service, right? The Orthodox rabbi, the rabbi prays like everybody else in the service, right? The rabbi, whether he's there or not there, there's a service. The major role of a rabbi is to be the teacher of the community. Rabbi Soloveitchik was known as the Malamed of the community, of the generation, the teacher of the community. We need to make sure that women play leadership roles as teachers. There's no reason in the world they can't, if they know the Jewish law, why aren't they answering Jewish law questions? It just means more questions will be asked. Because you and I both know that on questions of infertility in Jewish law, if there are women who can answer those questions, there will be more questions asked. There'll be more babies born. There'll be more whole families. There'll be less pain. Why is it that when there are opportunities to deal with not just the marital components, but unfortunately when families start to break up and a couple needs guidance on how to deal with all different religious issues, why haven't we trained women to be able to play those roles? For me, those are critical leadership roles. Mm-hmm. I'm much more interested in the roles than I am in the titles. And it's not just me, but as you know, there was a recent study done of the Orthodox community, of the modern Orthodox community. I personally like to be part of the Orthodox community without adjectives. I don't want to be part of a Haredi community. I don't want to be part of an open Orthodox. I want to be part of modern. I believe in a Judaism that's Orthodox, but I believe that that Judaism has to engage all Jews, and has to respect all Jews, and has to engage all people, and has to respect all people. We have, and that's a halacha, by the way. It says in the Code of Jewish Law, Mefarnesim Aniyei Yisrael im Aniyei Akum, or the exact text is Mefarnesim Aniyei Akum im Aniyei Yisrael. You have to help both the poor of the larger community and the poor of the Jews. You just don't make Shabbos for the Jews. You make Shabbos for society. We light lights for the world, not just for ourselves. I want women to play leadership roles in all of those pieces. And I want to make sure that they're educated to be able to play those roles. They should be answering questions on fertility in Jewish law. They should be answering the cutting edge. Those are the cutting edge issues. Genetics are the cutting edge issues. oocyte cryopreservation, IVF, IUI, all of those issues that are being dealt with. I want women to be able to answer the questions that deal with business ethics, right? There are all these business ethic issues. Why is it only that men can answer those questions? If women study the same text and the community decides that they have that knowledge, they should be able to answer that question. That is not a new concept put out by somebody in 2017 or 2018. That is found with the prophetess Devorah, who was given that responsibility. That is found in the Code of Jewish Law, that women can play that leadership role when the community recognizes their scholarship. Mm-hmm. We have to create portals of entry for their scholarship. Do I think all of the people who you mentioned have always followed all the time the Code of Jewish Law? Sometimes I think that we can have a conversation about it. Do I think all the people you mentioned have a place in the world to come far greater than mine? Most definitely. But I think that our responsibility has to be to make sure. And the privilege of being able, again, I've lived and continue to live a blessed life. First of all, I live a blessed life because I have a great wife. But I live a blessed life because I've had great opportunities to see what Rabbi Riskin has done and to see the scholarship of women in the institutions that he's created. My goal is to not only increase that scholarship, but to tachlitically, in a very purposeful way, make sure that they are embedded in leadership roles in Israeli society, as well as in serving communities throughout the Jewish world.
What's your position on women reading the Torah in public?
Again, I think that when it comes to a group of women reading Torah for themselves,
No. For the community as a whole.
then again, I subscribe to the position that reading the Torah for various reasons is not consistent with Orthodox Jewish law. Reading the Megillah, maybe, but not reading.
Yeah. Okay.
Just
I want you to explain to me
Right.
how you deal with the passage, and our viewers should understand. These sections of the Talmud are called tractates. There's a tractate called Megillah. In Tractate Megillah, it specifically addresses the question, who may read the Torah? And they talk about in public for the congregation.
Right.
And one of those that is specifically stated may read the Torah is women, with a caveat. And the
Right.
caveat in the Talmud in Megillah is, unless it offends the, it's hard to translate the right word, but the dignity of the congregation. It in some way is an offense to the congregation. If the congregation feels it is some way inappropriate for a woman to read from the Torah in public, then she doesn't. And it seems to me that historically, that has been the attitude of the synagogue community. The synagogue community has said, for various reasons, we don't want women up in front in a certain way, and it offends our dignity to have a woman reading the Torah. I do not believe that anymore applies to you, to a vast swath of Orthodox Jews and Orthodox rabbis. Obviously, it doesn't apply to conservative Reform rabbis or the movements, but that isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about within Orthodoxy. And what you described a moment ago was a drush on a halacha which said that if the situation changes in the community, the law changes. So that when women didn't know anything, you didn't teach them Talmud. But if that is no longer the case, it is not an offense. Not only that, you have an obligation to teach it, and it is not foolishness to teach your children, your daughters. And I'm asking you now, why doesn't the same operative principle apply here, where in many Orthodox congregations, and I know you don't like labels, but the reality is the labels are critical. In a synagogue like Avi Weiss's, and it seems to me like in the Ohr Torah stone institutions, it would not be offensive. It would not violate the dignity of Ohr Torah stone or of the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale or of Lincoln Square for a woman to get up in the middle of a formal service and read, Aliyah number 4. So explain to me why from your perspective, what I'm saying is not something you embrace.
Okay. First of all, the commentary on the study of Talmud is not a drash. Drash means it's a homiletical understanding.
Correct.
The commentaries that I cited are technical halachic commentaries on that page of Talmud, on that statement from the Talmud. Well, I just want to make sure the viewers understand.
Okay.
That's number one.
Okay.
The second
By the way,
thing,
however,
right.
And the reason why I use the word drash is, and I'll analogize something that our viewers will understand. An analogy is to how the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution of the United States. Right. The equivalent of the Constitution in the Jewish world is the Talmud. And the Talmud is there are even after the Talmud, there's all kinds of halachic discussions of the law that enable the law to continue to, I don't even say evolve, to sophisticate, the nuance of it. Okay.
I think evolve is a beautiful word.
Fine, okay. So there are many Orthodox Jews who don't want to hear the word. I appreciate that you're comfortable with the word. But in essence, every one of those is a drash. It's not a drash in the sense of it's a midrash, but law is a constant interpreting and reinterpreting. We know in the American system, the Supreme Court has sometimes reversed positions of earlier courts, each of which is supposed to be telling the American people what the Constitution means in terms of its original intent. Although you say to me it's not a drash, the reality is you have poskin, you have interpreters who are determining what the law means, and over time they change the interpretation and therefore the application of the law. That's the way in which I use the word drash for what you described, and I feel there's...
No, that's fine.
Okay,
That's fine.
okay. Then I'm asking you now in terms of Tractate Megillah, and telling it, which says explicitly women may read. That's how it begins. These are the ones who may read. It includes women. But there is a caveat to it, which has been operative in the Jewish world, and I think there's every right for that to be true. I don't know, however, why now. The same kind of process, halachic process, that you're willing to bring to the verse, if you teach your girls Talmud, you're teaching them foolishness, that no longer applies. Why is not the same thing true for Tractate Megillah, which says if it's not offensive to the tzibur, to the congregation, you may have women read from the Torah. They're explicitly permitted to do so.
Okay. So I'm going to answer the question in two ways.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, the Talmud is the part of the development of the oral tradition, but there is a code of text, that continues after the Talmud regarding multiple ideas, and that the Talmud creates infrastructure for those ideas. So if you look at the text that discusses women, by the way, talking about women reading, there are different types of reading. There's the reading of the Megillah that the tractate talks about, where the Megillah explains the reason why they are permitted, because af heim hayu ba'oto hanes, because they were part of the miracle. They were equal actors and players within the miracle. But the question is that when it comes to the reading of the Torah, is the obligation for men and women the same? And that since it may not be the same, because depending on what the purpose is for the reading of the Torah on Shabbat or during the week, so therefore there is a plethora of commentaries, the majority of commentaries, who would suggest and have suggested throughout the generations that women reading for men, not just for the reason that you mentioned of kavod habriut, which is the Hebrew text that's used, the respect for the community. And I understand the sensitivities that you bring because of the fact that society has changed. But there are other sources that deal with the fact that if women do not have the same obligation as men, therefore an obligation is what defines the ability to play that leadership role, not knowledge. So the same way that Orthodox Judaism would not allow a woman to serve as the chazan, because she doesn't have the same responsibility of praying in a quorum or to count or to be part of a quorum as men do. That's not a function, although I'm sure for many of your listeners, I'm going to get a D- on this response, and I respect where they're coming from. But therefore it's important that I say the part two of my answer. But the bottom line is that if we want to be true to the Orthodox Jewish tradition, the Orthodox Jewish tradition requires that for certain roles to be played, the actors need to be obligated. If they're not obligated, they can participate, they can't lead. And therefore, it's unfair just to look at that piece of Talmud frozen in time and to start from there, and not to look at hundreds of years of responsive literature that follow and develop that pathway, that the definition of that language has nothing to do with social nuances, but rather obligatory nuances. So if God forbid someone's parent passes away and they haven't buried them yet, and for the past 40 years of their life they have been part of the minyan, part of the quorum, and then they walk into synagogue the next day and they want to participate in the quorum and they have not yet buried their parent, it's irrelevant if they've been part of the minyan for the past decades. They can't be counted, because on that day, until they bury their parent, they're not obligated. Women have obligations, men have obligations. My son served in Golani, his friend served in the paratroopers. They have different obligations. They protect the state differently. Both men and women have responsibilities that sometimes are different. That's the way I look at it from a purely halachic legal perspective, which doesn't totally play well in the public. And I feel sorry about that, because I want to be liked by everybody. It's just not that on that issue. At the present time, it's not going to happen.
But
let me finish the part.
I will let you finish, but I want to say two things. Number one, you are liked by everybody.
Thank you.
And there is a sweetness and a wonderfulness to you.
Thank you.
And it doesn't matter whether I or anybody else agrees at any given
Thank you.
point.
Thank
okay.
you.
Number two, and then I'll continue.
Fine.
You understand that there's a continuum of how you deal with halacha. And every single thing you've said to me could be said to you by an Orthodox rabbi to your right.
I have had conversations with many Orthodox rabbis to my right. I love them, and I'm close with them, as I am with members of
and they think that some of the things you're espousing for women at Ohr Torah Stone cross a line.
And they think that many of the things that Ohr Torah Stone is doing for women, thank God that they're not doing it, but somebody else is.
You know exactly what I mean.
Right.
There are Orthodox rabbis who will argue that what you've just said about why you don't want to follow a Talmudic dictum, which is not ambiguous. It says clearly, a woman may read from the Torah. You don't want to follow that, and I have respect for that. And your argument is there are generations of halachic commentary, halachic exposition of that, which solidify other reasons and make it just not part of the tradition. Okay, I accept that. I'm only saying to you that once you use that as your reasoning, it's why the guy to your right says to you, well then, don't you understand? Much of what you're doing is otherwise we would be doing it. Why aren't we doing it? And you are doing it.
My response to them on that issue is the following. First of all, again, that one statement in Megillah is not the beginning and end of women playing those prayer roles. But my statement to somebody who would ask me and say, I stand, unlike when it comes to women leading a service or reading the Torah, where Rabbi Riskin has written, and I subscribe to that, that it's not permitted. Rabbi Riskin has written that in text in Tchumim, for those who want to look it up. He's written it because you're not standing on anyone's shoulders. When I advocate the fact, or when the Jewish community advocates the fact, more important than me, that women should play leadership roles and that we should educate them, I'm standing on the shoulders of people like the Chafetz Chaim, who opened up the schools for women to study. I'm standing on the shoulders of great people like Rabbi Soloveitchik, who gave the first Talmud class at Stern College, not because he didn't want to delegate it to anybody else, because he wanted everybody to know that he gave it. Or the fact, as you mentioned, that he was responsible for Maimonides and insisted that both men and women in Maimonides study Talmud. That's not 10 years ago.
Day school.
In Maimonides Day School.
Yes.
And let me just say part two of my
Please
answer.
go ahead.
That is, I think that that I've always learned from my teachers that part of leadership is also the difference between a leader and someone walking alone can be 2 feet. I want to work with others and please God, play a leadership role. And that means that I want to do things that I believe that the vast majority of the Orthodox community, which I think will change all of the Jewish community, because when you have more women playing leadership roles, it won't just affect the Orthodox community, it will affect the entire community. And I think that if you asked leaders in the Reform and Conservative movement, they would tell you that also. I believe that you have to work on issues that you feel that you're on totally solid ground on. And I believe when it comes to women playing leadership roles, I and my colleagues are on solid religious, spiritual, halachic, agadic, fill-in-the-blank ground. And it's our responsibility to move that forward as leaders, not people walking alone, but as leaders. And to do it in a way that communities like Lincoln Square Synagogue, who will not allow women to play those roles that you articulated, and other institutions that you mentioned who will not allow women to play those roles that you articulated, I want them to look at these women and feel that, hey, it's time for us to change our makeup. And if there are 1,000 communities, 1,000 synagogues that will embrace this over the next 10 years, which I truly believe is a possibility. The only problem is we don't yet have enough women educated enough to play those leadership roles. Because I sit in a place where I have the privilege of working with women who are getting a master's in advanced Talmud and biblical interpretation. And I see that for every one that graduates, they all have 4 job offers. That should be for all the male students, right? We don't have enough people. So I want to push the envelope in a way where I think I'm on solid ground and in a way in which I think the community will embrace, and in a way, most importantly, that I feel that there is a fidelity to Jewish tradition. And I am reminded of the fact that when I drive my car, it says in the right-hand mirror that images sometimes look closer than they appear. So I have to stop worrying about my left shoulder and my right shoulder, or else my neck's going to hurt me. And I just got to move things forward, again, standing on halachic ground.
I would hope it's not simply the Orthodox world. I want the Jewish community as a whole, and then I want the world as a whole to understand the perspective you bring. And I'm very cognizant of the difference between men and women. Men and women are not the same, but they're all human beings. And each human being should be viewed with a sanctity, and they should be given every opportunity to be what they can be. But it's not to say they're identical. And I have no problem, and there are non-Orthodox Jews who do, I have no problem with the nature of role in the Jewish community. And if there are, as long as a woman is not being coerced, if she embraces this, there should not be a whisper of criticism. It's inappropriate. It's not only inappropriate, it just means you don't have respect for human beings. If you have respect for human beings, it doesn't mean they have to do it exactly as you do.
Exactly.
So I understand the difference in role. And I think that
I enjoyed your introduction. I actually, look forward next time you're in Israel speaking to the women at Ohr Torah Stone and having that conversation.
I would be so flattered.
And I think they would benefit greatly from that.
I'm going to hold you to that.
I'm going to hold you to it also.
Okay, that's so sweet of you. Anyway, I love what you're doing, and the fact that I push you, especially on this issue of, I believe at one time there will come a time, and I believe it'll be the text that's used as the proof text. I believe at some time, even within the Orthodox movement, there will be an evolution, and one day there'll be a reading. There'll be a rabbi, a woman reading Aliyah number 4. And by the way, what you said, and our audience should understand, in the Jewish tradition, if you're not required to do something, you can't fulfill that for another human being.
Correct.
And what a leader of a congregation does, what a shliach tzibur does, is he helps the other Jew fulfill his mitzvah. And if you're not required to do it yourself, you can't fulfill it for another person. So you can't. If one of the things a chazan does as a shliach tzibur who leads a congregation in prayer is help the congregation fulfill its obligation to pray, and you're not required to do it, you can't act as the one who facilitates. And at the moment, that is an overarching principle of halacha. And what the Reform movement and the Conservative movement have done is they've played with it because something is more important to them. Fine. As long as you say what's true. That's the truth. Fine. You talked about the fact that when you were young, you questioned. I wanted to know, did you ever question God?
I question, yes.
Okay. If I say to you, I believe in the Jewish tradition, the Talmudic tradition, permits, that Maimonides permits the Jew doubt, and that the issue is not whether you doubt or not. The question is how you behave in the midst of your doubt. That you act ki'ilu, as if there's a God that you're sure of, even if you are unsure. Are you comfortable with my saying that and articulating it that way?
I am, and let me explain, if I can, for a minute why. Number one is, I think that it's interesting, again, going back to the Talmud discusses the different writers of the biblical text. When it discusses Job, it says, maybe Adam wrote Job, maybe Job was written in the time of Moses, maybe it was written in the time of the patriarchs, and the matriarchs, whether at different times, the Talmud says. And then it says maybe Job didn't exist. Rabbi Soloveitchik, in one of his articles, says the Talmud is not arguing about when Job was written. It's trying to tell you there's a Job in every generation, and there's a piece of Job in every one of us. And while the rabbis struggled with certain texts of whether they should be part of the canonized text, the Song of Songs, the Proverbs, because they're very challenging texts and hard to understand, it never asked that question about Job. It always wanted Job to be part of the canonized text. Because Job is about not just why bad things happen to good people, but when bad things happen to good people, how does one handle it? And again, I have lived a blessed life. 20-something years ago, 25 years ago, my wife and I lost, my wife Ruchi and I lost a baby daughter.
I'm so sorry.
A baby girl. She was only a few days old. And there's no bigger thing to question than when you lose and you are anticipating this unbelievable opportunity and experience of having a child. Thank God we have 5 beautiful children at home. And again, as I said, 2 wonderful daughters-in-law who are no different than our daughter. But when you lose a child, you never forget it. And no matter how much blessing you've had in your life. And my wife, Ruchi, actually used that opportunity to do something that has taught me for my whole life, and that is when something bad happens, she actually was able to work with a member of the Florida Senate. We lived in Florida then, and then with others who had lost a child for what's called beta strep, for the reason we lost a child, and created practice parameters that were supported by the various agencies in Washington to create practice parameters for OBGYNs. So sometimes when you have a tragedy happen, and you're able to turn it into an opportunity for people to have better lives. I saw the way my wife, Ruchi, did that. And we don't get them anymore, but for the first 10 years or so afterwards, we got phone calls on a regular basis from people saying, hey, I heard you were part of the group that created these practice parameters. You should know that our son or daughter had this groupie strep, and because of the practice parameters that you created for OBGYNs, she's enjoying a wonderful life.
Oh.
So, I have truly internalized that question. I had no way of knowing that I did, but I totally internalized that question, and I've seen it. I really have seen it. So I do believe that there's nothing wrong with questioning. I do also believe that it's how you act as a human being when you deal with challenges that really define who you are and who you'll become, and your responsibilities to the world.
There's a very famous drosh on a line from Deuteronomy. The line is, Lo bashamayim hi.
Right.
It's a reference to the fact that the Torah is not in heaven. That becomes basically a punchline of a classic midrash in which the end is God speaks and the rabbis say to God, "But out." And they quote to God, Lo bashamayim hi. You have written, the Torah is not in heaven. It's in our mouths and in our hearts, and we're to do it. And from here on, we, the Jewish community, by the way, it's not the average Jew, it's not the average Yid in some synagogue somewhere. It's those who are scholars and in community have the right to determine what Torah means and how one practices Torah. I believe that midrash, which is based on a Torah verse, the Torah is not in heaven, is one of the most essential, not only principles of Judaism, it distinguishes Judaism from virtually every other intellectual philosophy, where it says, even if there's a God, we trust human beings, and even when human beings make a mistake, we'll live with their mistake, and God will live with their mistake until they get it right. I believe that that is what drives the learned Jewish community respond to that.
Mark, as you beautifully quoted that piece of Talmud, it ends with the fact that God says, "Nitzchuni b'nai nitzchuni."
Yes.
And it's often translated as,
yes,
"My children have won."
Yes.
But it can mean something else also. Nitzchuni b'nai nitzchuni can also mean, "My children have immortalized me," because the word netzach, the root of the word immortalized.
That's the drash by the Gaon of Vilna.
Right.
Who says,
right, my children have immortalized me. My children have immortalized me.
The Torah will be forever.
Right.
And
I will be forever. God will be forever. And I think that speaks to the fact that I think our dream has to be that men and women who are scholars immortalize God through their teachings, and men and women who are scholars immortalize God by making sure that Jewish law is always a living and breathing organism. Nowhere in the Torah does it say how you deal with the unbelievable opportunities that science have given us in genetics. But the Talmud and the Torah have given us the infrastructure on how to deal with those issues. Nowhere in the Torah and the Talmud does it speak about privacy issues when it comes to the internet. But the Talmud and the Torah have given us a superstructure on how to deal with that. And it's the responsibility for informed men and informed women to be able to move it forward, to move the ball forward, and to drive on that Yam Shel Talmud, on that sea of Jewish tradition, and to move the ideals forward. Because we don't just succeed when we do that. We immortalize God, and we guarantee the eternality of the Jewish people.
You are fabulous.
Thank
Yotzei min haklal.
Thank you.
You talked about all the ways in which you're lucky. Mm-hmm. Your students are lucky. Ohr Torah Stone is lucky. Our viewers here on JBS have been lucky to meet you. I will not let this hand go unless you promise me, when you're available and in your travels throughout the United States, and you come to the New York area, you'll sit in this chair again and you'll let me probe you more.
Okay, I look forward to it.
Will you do that for me?
You just have to wait till I know a little bit more about what I'm doing so I can answer intelligently.
You're fabulous.
All right,
You're
thank
fabulous. The thoughts of Rabbi Kenny Brander, the new president and rosh yeshiva of Ohr Torah Stone educational institutions in Israel. And by the way, they're here in America as well. And again, how lucky if you've been a viewer of JBS, you know I'm crazy for Shlomo Riskin. He picked the right man. I'm now crazy about Kenny Brander, and you said you'd be here often. I will hold you to that. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed here on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. And if you'd like to be in touch with Rabbi Kenny Brander yourself, you send me an email. I will forward it on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.